They have to deliver pain to where it matters inside of Russia.
And how can they deliver that pain effectively?
Some things are better not said on camera.
How was Ukraine able to push into Russia so quickly and so deeply?
Well, it's very suitable terrain for maneuver, for armored maneuver. Clearly, they had intelligence that the Russians had assumed the Ukrainians would not invade any of their terrain, and they obviously thinned up their troops down to where it was not even army groups on the border; it was just some border police, and the Ukrainians pushed right through that. So I think it's probably a strategy by the Ukrainians to make them redeploy forces away from the combat zone and actually make them defend their borders.
And what is the military strategic consequence of this latest offensive for the war in Ukraine?
I think it makes it possible in terms of negotiating. If they have terrain that was Russia, they can give that back. That also becomes tradable. They captured 100 or 200 Russian soldiers, and again, it adds to the pool of soldiers that or prisoners that they can swap. I'd say the main reason, though, was to take pressure off the areas where the Ukrainians are losing terrain and make the Russians pull troops away from there, because you have to make them defend everywhere. Otherwise, it's too easy for them to accrue a manpower and material advantage.
Can Ukraine win tactically on the ground in this war?
I don't think so. No, I think the sooner there's a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities, the better. Mathematically, it's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for the Ukrainians to win. Even if all their material was fantastic, if they had enough of it, which they don't, they just don't have enough manpower. And in a war of attrition, numbers matter. Numbers are really the only thing that matters.
There are some who say that manpower is no longer required for a war when we have drones and technology and so on. Do you think the lesson from the conflict in Ukraine is that actually men and boots on the ground do matter?
It's still ultimately a battle of wills, and however valiant the Ukrainians have fought, and they've innovated. They've definitely made great strides in developing long range missiles. The Court missile has been scoring well. The FPV drones, they've done a lot of innovation, but the fact is the numbers are still very much against them. And I hope for the sake of their society's survival, the fighting is brought to an end soon.
Do you think that this latest offensive by the Ukrainians was a wise move ultimately, because they may have lost the moral high ground, they were the ones on the defensive, now they're actually invading another country?
Well, I guess the jury's out on that decision. I would worry about how the Russians retaliate against other Ukrainian infrastructure. Do they smash government buildings? Do they smash more power plants or a nuclear plant? I don't know what level of retribution is coming, but I'm sure it will be painful.
So you feel that the Russians have held back in some way, that they could go much harder and they could inflict a lot more damage on Ukrainian infrastructure? And
Sure,
okay.
sure.
So do you expect to see that happening, I guess, in the next few weeks?
I'd say the chances of that are higher now than they were 2 weeks ago. Yes.
And in terms of the Russian perspective, what should they be doing strategically? Can they actually defeat Ukraine, or is this just a static kind of frozen conflict?
Look, they are slowly gaining terrain in the east. It's a grind, but the numbers and math are on their side. Their economy. Remember, the Russians are paying for this themselves. The United States and a little bit the rest of Europe is paying for Ukraine. And so the Russian economy is stronger now than before. The ruble is trading stronger. For all the overuse, the easy button of sanctions has proven to be a real failure. And for American long-term interest, de-dollarizing oil trade and the world's economy is exceedingly dangerous because the U.S. funds its $34 trillion, $35 trillion debt because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. The more we penalize people for trading in dollars, the less they're going to do. And then the United States has to go on a real diet and it cannot have budget deficits like it does. So that's kind of a self-correcting, self-inflicted wound.
How does this kind of warfare and conflict compare with the wars fought in the Middle East after 9/11, What are the kind of changes that have happened over the last 20 years?
Uh, Look, this is ultimately a full-on conventional war. The wars in the Middle East were largely insurgencies and counterinsurgencies where the U.S. was trying to fight with all this restraint and allowing lawyers to make every decision about when a bomb gets dropped and when it doesn't get dropped. This fight in Ukraine is a full-on one of kind of tribal extinction. You add to that the acceleration factor that drones have provided, and you saw drones use drone strikes where a drone at 25, 30,000 feet is watching some insurgents and it takes some precision shot trying to be very surgical. In this case, drones are flown at 1 meter, 10 meters, very close to the earth. It's really democratized precision strike. Whereas before, that drone in 2002 would be flown by someone hundreds of miles away, controlled by satellite, taking some precision shot. Now, a drone is carried in someone's backpack. It has a beer can size charge of maybe 2 kilos, but they can fly that drone with such precision that they can even destroy a multi-million-dollar tank because it can hit exactly the right weakest spot. So to me, it is a massive step change in war. It's like going from the longbows and spears of Agincourt to not a wheel lock or a matchlock, but to bolt action and even machine guns. That's how much precision strike has now proliferated to the battlefield, and it's really accelerated things.
So, what does this mean for the American military? How does the American military adapt to this new kind of warfare?
Well, they haven't yet, and I don't think they're fully learning the lessons. The dangerous thing is that the Russian military has gotten much better, much more effective. They have adapted to this speed and pace of war and the democratization of that precision. The Russians, if you shot at them a year and a half ago, it would take an hour and a half for them to shoot back. Now it's 2 or 3 minutes, and they're shooting back with accurate artillery fire. The U.S. has bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of stuff over the last decades. A lot of it is just relegated now to inventory because in the pace of precision fire down to the squad or the fire team, so much of that stuff can be very, very quickly destroyed. So the U.S. military has almost been the biggest loser, I believe, of this conflict because its entire paradigm of warfare has been upended. But the sad thing is the leadership of the Pentagon doesn't even fully realize that or embrace that, to their detriment and to the detriment of American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines.
So, do you have this new technology in drones and so on, which are very cheap or which can be produced very cheaply by countries like Iran, and they can destroy incredibly expensive military equipment like tanks that we saw in Ukraine? So, how does a country which has the kind of technological and financial advantage sort of go against a country which can be much more strategic and sort of use its smaller resources to destroy these very, very expensive items and equipment?
There's a window of time right now where the advantage is swung hard towards the attacker. Eventually, defensive take capabilities will catch up, whether it's more nets or armor or hard kill and soft kill. That could be air bursting rounds, it could be lasers, it could be EMPs. Lots of things, but a lot of those are going to have to catch up because right now the advantage is to the guy that can carry 6 attack drones in his backpack and from a high point of ground can go and smash targets 15 kilometers away. That's exceedingly dangerous capability.
You were one of the founders of Blackwater, the private military contractor. Are military contractors being used in Ukraine?
I think there's some advisory stuff done. I think the U.S. said that they were going to allow some contractors for maintenance and service of some of the sophisticated systems, but I know of no major. I wouldn't say I'm not in that space anymore per se. Certainly not on the U.S. government contractor side. So I know of no large deployments of folks other than a few technicians here and there.
What about on the Russian side? Are they using private military people?
Well, you heard about the Wagner Group, of course, which was a Russian private military contractor. Prigozhin, the founder, certainly got crossways with a lot of the Russian military leadership, and it definitely became a food fight between the MOD, the military intelligence, the KGB, and he was definitely a casualty of that internal fight. But the Russians learned back in 2014 already to use contracted capability as a hybrid force. They used it effectively in Syria, in Mozambique, in Madagascar. They effectively own the Central African Republic now. They have forces now in Libya, Mali, and Burkina Faso. So they're the Russians had always been typical providers of hardware, and now they're providing hardware yet, and then manpower to run that equipment effectively in a lot of these markets. And they're using it as an entry point wedge issue to get in and to sell more of their stuff and to have diplomatic, not just influence, but sway.
If you were advising the Ukrainian military, what would you tell them? And I know you're saying that they should end the war as soon as possible, but in terms of staying in the fight, getting better terms and so on, what should the Ukrainians be doing right now?
Look, they have to deliver pain to where it matters inside of Russia, because if it's a matter of average Russians feeling no pain from the conflict, I think it gives incentive for Putin to go on as long as he needs to until he feels he's done.
And how can they deliver that pain effectively?
Some things are better not said on camera.
I want to talk about Blackwater. Why did you found the company?
I founded it because I was getting out of the Navy earlier than I planned to. My wife was 29 and she got cancer. My father died. And I planned to stay in the SEAL teams for 10, 12 years. And I got out instead to sort out the family issues. And SEAL teams had been using private facilities really since the 1970s. America has a gun culture. And so there was lots of smaller private shooting schools, and no one had done it on an industrial scale. And because of my father's success, and I knew what units like that needed, I built it. I mean, I knew nothing of government contracting, nothing of land development, and really not much about business. But started it figuring there was a need, and started smaller, but grew with the demands of the customers. And it started as a training facility. Started construction in '97. Opened in '98, struggled for the first few years. And again, you adapt to what your customers need. We started doing target systems because we had very destructive customers that would shoot up everything. And then when 9/11 happened and the government needed more support overseas, and at that point, I'd also been turning around a manufacturing business and had really figured out how to make it lean. And so kind of applied those lessons to Blackwater, to the recruiting, vetting, equipping, training, deploying, and supporting people, effectively what a military does. And we just became very, very efficient at doing that. And so we could be the low-cost competitor in whatever bid we were going after.
How did 9/11 impact Blackwater?
Sure, it impacted us because it put a huge demand signal, because you had a massive U.S. military that was great in conventional capability, but when you have a military force that rolls across Iraq or Afghanistan, and now it has to stop and trying to retask your guy that's a chemical warfare specialist or an air defense artilleryman, and they have to be a police trainer or a bodyguard or something like that. The militaries have a hard time doing that, and so they created gaps, and those temporary gaps were filled by contracted capability, and that's what we were good at.
What do you make of Eisenhower's phrase, the military-industrial complex? Is it real? Is it powerful?
Oh, he's exactly right. I've been calling that out and amplifying those comments for years. The very unhealthy amount of money that defense contractors spend on lobbyists to pay politicians to spend more on an already overpriced military, which then those defense contractors take those overpriced contracts and spend more money on lobbyists. It's a very unhealthy cycle. The United States spends more than the next 17 countries combined in defense. And I would argue that we're not getting much for that money. And we've allowed a way over consolidation, because there used to be about 100 major defense contractors. It's now over consolidated down to 5, and they really behave like a cartel. And that's dangerous, and it's not very innovative. If you think about all this, the fast innovation that's happened in Ukraine from that fight, it's all been guys operating out of their garages. Smart people with a little bit of knowledge about the problem set, and they're given leeway, and the government will buy from them. That's how you go faster. Even the Israelis realize how badly they were taken by surprise and that they stepped into the fight that Hamas wanted them to have in Gaza. And so they're really responding by a lot more tech innovation at call it the garage level. And the same, for all their Iron Dome and their high altitude ballistic missile defenses, 50% of the small loitering munitions, kamikaze drones launched from Lebanon by Hezbollah are still getting into Israel. That's a huge problem. So again, there's a lot of garage level innovation going, and they'll catch up and they'll defeat that problem. So, but I'd say for now, for the next 3-4 years, huge advantage goes to the operator with lots of small drones.
How do Blackwater fit in within the military-industrial complex?
Well, we didn't really have lobbyists, so we were not part of that club ever. We didn't hire the crop of retired generals. We responded to bids that the military put out, and they needed training for XYZ, or they needed aviation support, or they needed lots of bodyguard support. It was stuff that the traditional defense contractors didn't really do anyway. Our air wing grew to 73 aircraft that we owned and operated. No other defense contractor was willing to do that, to actually put their money into aircraft and to fly them literally in a hot zone. 4 of our aircraft were shot down in combat. No other defense contractors were dumb enough to do what we did, to put their balance sheet at the service of the U.S. military.
And do you buy into this idea that these military-industrial companies, this sort of cartel that you described, that they're kind of pushing for war, lobbying for the U.S. to get involved in all of these conflicts around the world and to actually encourage what's going on in, say, the Middle East and so on?
When you see people like Lindsey Graham and some of the other people that are just constantly calling for more intervention, more spending, more of the same insanity, it speaks to the real detachment of the Washington elites that literally don't have skin in the game. Lindsey Graham has no kids in combat. So, when the Roman Empire had a devastating loss at the Battle of Cannae, 2 weeks later when the Roman Senate met, it was 40% undermanned. Why? Because Roman elites actually served in battle. It's the one downside of an all-volunteer force is the Washington elites largely do not have any kids with any service experience or exposure. And so it's very easy for them to call for more and more blood and treasure into the cauldron when it's not any of their loved ones that understand. Even in America, you have basically 0.5% that serves in the military, another 3 or 4% that knows that 0.5%, and the other 95% of America has no flipping idea. And so they're easily bullshitted on more of the same insane policies. When we had a War Department, we had a military, it seemed, that was still serious about fighting and ending wars. Department of Defense, we have a very, very mixed record for the last 75 years.
Why do you think the Taliban ultimately defeated the US and its allies in Afghanistan?
If we had in the first 6 months after 9/11, the Taliban were actively hunted. They were afraid because the targeting to implementation cycle was very quick between there's a target, kill the target. When the conventional military rolled into Afghanistan and when Bagram Air Force Base became a saluting zone and you had to shave and you had to be starched and all the generals showed up, that the cycle time of find, fix, finish went from minutes or hours to days and months. And so already by 2016, 17, there was 130 Taliban sanctuaries inside Afghanistan. Now, if you're the U.S. military commander, there shouldn't be one Taliban sanctuary. There should not be one known Taliban area where they're hanging out where you say, well, we're not going to send troops in there because that's a hot zone. Why do people rob banks? It's where the money is. You want to go defeat the Taliban? Go to where they want to fight you or draw them out. But for heaven's sakes, don't give them one, let alone 130 sanctuaries. That's why, because we had a lot of unserious people that were given responsibility. We went through, I think, 18 different commanders in Afghanistan, and it was all just past the buck. It was managing conflict instead of ending it, and it's embarrassing. And so for every Afghan veteran that lost a friend or a loved one or their limb or their mental health, they should be angry. To have it really just kind of pissed away by really, really pathetic leadership.
They talk about Afghanistan as being the place where empires go to die. Britain famously in the 19th century struggled in Afghanistan. Russia in 1979 again invaded Afghanistan, completely failed. And more recently in 2021, the US had its kind of chaotic withdrawal under President Biden. Do you think there's something inherent about Afghanistan, its people, its terrain and so on, that lends itself to insurgency and defeating these large empires? Or, was it possible for America to win that war?
Mountainous terrain is always more difficult, so it gives some advantage to the defender. However, the Russians had largely pacified Afghanistan. They had killed their way to success. It was in 1980s dollars, $1 billion a year of lethal aid provided by the US to include manpads, which drove the Soviets out. There was never anywhere near that kind of external support for the Taliban while the US was there. We were our own worst enemies. The Taliban's operating budget was about $600 million a year. They made a third of that off of tolling the US fuel supply being trucked in from Pakistan, a third of it on drugs, and a third of it on illicit mining. 600 million bucks was more than enough to sustain that enterprise against the United States. And we got beat. We should be embarrassed, but nobody got fired. Literally, no one was fired for complete and abject failure. And so when you fail to penalize bad performance, you get a lot more bad performance. So literally the only general that was fired for the 20 some years of Afghanistan was Stan McChrystal because he said some critical things against Obama. Some of his staff did in a drunken night in a bar with a reporter there. So again, I read an interesting book a year ago. It's called The Psychology of Military Incompetence. And it's written on like 5 of the major failures in British military history. And it looks back at the psyche and the upbringing of those generals that made that decision. And a lot of similarities. And I hope someone writes the same book on our U.S. military command for the last 30 years to call this out, because we are deluding ourselves if we think we're going to automatically win the next one just because we did well in World War II. We have a very different military culture, a very different psyche amongst the leadership anymore, and it's just that dog's not going to hunt.
Well, I think famously Admiral Bing in Britain was court-martialed and I think hanged. I forget how they killed him, but for his sort of cowardice or his refusing to or losing in battle against, I think, the French. And that was like an example to his other commanders at the time of this is what happens when, you don't perform well. You'll literally, get killed. And, his name was then became infamous in the British military for sort of centuries after that. And in the Second World War, you had American generals being fired all the time, British generals being fired all the time for failures, and
That's
so
right.
on. So what changed? Why has there been this massive sea change? Is it HR? Is it a different culture? What's going on?
I'd say it's the effects of the therapeutic society that has bled over into the military. And look, we've allowed lawyers to become what Zampolits were, political officers were in the Soviet Union. When you have lawyers deciding whether you can drop a bomb or whether you can attack or what you can do, you don't really have the authority as a military commander anymore, or they have given up that authority by punting it to the lawyers instead of saying, "I'm in command here. This is what's happening. Shut up and get out of my way." We need more of that because we have a military that is not up to the task right now.
As a veteran, I want to ask about this row around Tim Waltz's stolen valor, so-called stolen valor. What do you make of his sort of claims that he fought in Iraq and then, it turns out that he didn't do that?
It's um, the idea of being the position of the senior enlisted advisor, the command master chief, or the command sergeant major, to be in that role and then to quit as your units when you find out your unit is going to deploy with is such a violation of trust. It is the antithesis of the brotherhood of the warrior class. It's it it's hard to understand for non-military people, but it is horrific beyond comparison. It says it all.
He's hit back at JD Vance and says, I'm not criticizing anyone's military service. I don't think people should do that. What do you make of his defense of this affair, I guess?
Uh, he served in the National Guard for 24 years, but when it came time to do a combat deployment, he quit. Bad. It's a bad look. There's no positive way to spin that. But again, the people that are from the therapeutic society will want to spin that and say, well, he served in uniform and he was in the National Guard and he showed up on weekends to drill once in a while. Yeah, but if you join the military to serve your time on the wall defending the country, and then when it's your time to stand on the wall to do that, you walk away to run for Congress. No, just bad. No positive way to spin that.
You talk about therapeutic society. I know that some say that society has become too, how do I put this politically correctly, like female orientated, and sort of the attack on alpha males or being a man or sort of male traits, that's kind of become far less popular, and more female traits have become dominant. Do you think that that's the case?
I'd say studies would back up that conclusion. Um, and look, nature has a way of correcting that pendulum. And there's that saying that hard men bring good times bring soft men. And we're in a period of a lot of soft people, and a lot of soft people in leadership, unserious people that continue to make some bad decisions. And a lot of people, unfortunately, will suffer the consequences of those bad decisions until it's corrected again. But, society is an ebb and flow, and we're maybe in a bit of an ebb right now.
Why is the US military struggling to recruit people, particularly white men?
Well, because the leadership of the Biden military said that white men were the problem. And so it made a lot of white men reconsider whether they were going to join. If you look at the casualty, who serves in the combat arms units of the military, it's largely white Southern men. Even if you look at the casualty counts from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's a consistent numbers of states that show up to do that. And when you say that white rage and all of that is the problem, and that DEI and ESG is the solution, then you tend to drive away the people that want to serve. There's a there's an interesting book called On Killing by Dave Grossman, and he's an army psychologist, and he actually studies um, who actually did the fighting in World War II or Korea. And his studies show, he looks through all the military data, it was less than 20% of actual soldiers in World War II fired their weapons at the enemy, of infantry soldiers. The fighting and the killing was done by artillery and automatic weapons. That number changed a bit, but he also shows that there's a natural 2% of society, the natural sheepdog uh, minded people that naturally join a commando type unit. And that's why those personnel can perform on a man to man basis so much better. And so, again, those numbers have remained pretty strong because they want to join a special operations unit, but the regular line military units, they have a true recruiting problem because, but the unit that hasn't had that recruiting problem is the Marine Corps. And if you notice, the U.S. Marine Corps, and if you notice, their recruiting paradigm is maybe if you're good enough, you can be one of us. Come and join, come up to our level and be a Marine. Not, hey, join up and we're going to pay for college. You don't have to start till 9 a.m. and we're going to make it really easy. That does not attract the kind of people you want to build a military around. And so until the Army, Navy, and Air Force figure that out, they're going to continue to have problems. But I think a different paradigm shift with leaders that applaud and ask families to say, listen, send me your sons and daughters for 2 to 4 years. We're going to give them great experience. They're going to learn. They're going to join a fraternity of arms and return to you as better adults. The numbers will come back. It's fixable.
I moved to the US earlier this year, and one of the things that surprised me was that there's this stereotype around Marines, a negative stereotype, which kind of shocked me. I don't know if you want to comment on that or not, but just a few people mentioned that, and I thought that was strange.
Well, the people that criticize the Marine Corps probably don't have a leg to stand on, and probably could not be a Marine, and so they criticize it because they're probably tilting towards the therapeutic society that I was speaking of earlier. But look, the Marine Corps has an esprit de corps, a pride. They take their uniform seriously. They take their history seriously. They actually teach the history of the Marine Corps to those kids at boot camp. And it's excellent. And God bless the Marine Corps. Thank God for them.
Just a final few questions on the state of the US military. Is the US military ready for a major conflict?
I am greatly concerned that the assumptions made by our military leaders may be fed to them in a very ugly manner. Maybe they may have those lessons or those assumptions fed back to them at the end of a bayonet.
If there is a war in Taiwan, can the US defeat China?
Well, the thing about military power is about how you concentrate force at the point of at the Schwerpunkt, at the inflection point. And the Pacific Ocean is a vast space, and the U.S. military is very large and very capable. But to say it's as large and as capable at that point of inflection, just what, 60, 70 miles off the coast of China, where they have a massive amount of surface to surface and surface to air missile capability, and it's on their home turf, that becomes a very, very difficult fight to predict. And the other thing is, the U.S. military is generally very predictable, and so if something clacks off there, if we fight by the playbook that we're expecting to, I think we'd lose. But there's a lot of unconventional ways to address the Chinese military, and I hope smarter people are coming up with those kind of plans and ideas, and that they're listened to, because the IDF, for all their capability, all their military mismatch against Hamas, blundered in and fought the fight in Gaza that Hamas wanted to have, in tunnels, to kill to kill and injure lots of civilians, and they're still not done, and they've taken a lot of casualties, and the reputation of Israel has definitely been damaged severely globally because of that. I would worry. To me, I think the beginning of the end of the British Empire started at the Battle of Jutland, when the British Navy for 100 years ruled the waves after defeating Napoleon's navy at Trafalgar. Yeah, and then a rising industrial power of Germany fought Britain to a draw at Jutland. They were not defeated by Britain at all, and that was, to me, that was the beginning of the end. If the U.S. blunders into a naval escapade off of Taiwan and gets spanked and loses a carrier or two, it will have catastrophic knock-on effects to the U.S. economy and to the appearance of U.S. hegemony in the world.
When Britain and I think the Dutch lost their colonies to Japan in the Second World War, many kind of Asians who saw white men as being, or the whites as being kind of superior, particularly militarily, suddenly lost their confidence in those old empires. And you're right, so it's basically a sort of psychological impact that may have on, it may have on the world if the US loses or is seen to lose a major conflict. So would you warn America, or would you warn its leaders against defending Taiwan for that reason?
I would. The best defense for Taiwan is to build a home guard. In the same way that when America fought for independence from the Brits, there was 30% that were pro-crown, there was 40% in the middle that didn't really care, there was 30% that were pro-liberty. 10% of that 30% or 3% were all that are actually fought against the Brits. If you took 3% of the Taiwan population and built them into a home guard, whether that's the active police, some good reservists, the CrossFitters, the marathoners, the civil defense people, the paramedics, and you gave them some training so they could defend neighborhood by neighborhood so that everything became dangerous territory. I think the Taiwanese armed force is like 150,000. It's very corrupt, very weak, very soy laden. And instead you had what, 24 million, 3% of 720,000 people that have the training and the willpower and the locality and area knowledge. That's a very difficult math equation for an attacking enemy to say, yep, we're going to take it. Because if China is going to go after Taiwan, they have to do it quick. They cannot sustain 2 years of sanctions because they are importing a huge amount of hydrocarbons and food, and they need trade for their economy. So to me, the cheapest thing is build a home guard, kind of push that on them to say that's how you're going to be defended. That's better than trying to, and much, much, much cheaper than saying we're going to deploy 3 carrier battle groups and this many ships and all the rest. Don't give China the predictable fight.
Erik Prince, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.